In the heart of a relentless winter, where icy winds howled through barren branches and snow blanketed the rugged landscape, lived a young woman named Ilara. Her hands were calloused from years of toil, her spirit unyielding against the harshness of life in the mountains of Eldoria. It was on one such morning, as grey clouds smothered the sky and frost clung stubbornly to every surface, that Ilara's path crossed with destiny. She had risen before dawn, bundling herself in a patched cloak that did little to shield her from the biting cold. Her basket, lined with linen, carried eggs still warm from the henhouse and a handful of dried herbs she'd carefully gathered the night before. The market in Windmere village awaited, though it was over an hour's walk away, a journey made treacherous by frozen mud and unpredictable weather. But Ilara was no stranger to hardship. She had grown up learning to read the whispers of the forest and endure the sting of frost-bitten fingers. As she trudged along the narrow trail, her boots crunching through fresh powder, something caught her eye, a set of hoofprints in the snow. They zigzagged erratically as if the horse had been panicked or its rider disoriented. Frowning, Ilara followed the tracks, her breath visible in short puffs of vapor. After a few meters, she spotted something glinting faintly beneath the frost. Bending down, she picked it up, a brooch, golden and intricately carved, with the emblem of a lily, crowned by a royal crest. Her heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary piece of jewelry. The symbol belonged to House Valerian, the ruling family of Eldoria. Clutching the brooch tightly, Ilara wrapped it in her linen cloth and tucked it into a small pocket inside her cloak. She quickened her pace, her senses sharp, when suddenly the sound of hooves shattered the silence. A distant whinny sent shivers down her spine. Rounding a bend in the path, she saw him, a man sprawled half-buried in the snow, his dark coat torn and soaked, his face pale and unmoving. Blood caked the side of his head, and his lips were tinged blue from the cold. Yet, he breathed, shallowly, but steadily. Without hesitation, Ilara acted. Calling her loyal mare, Willow, to her side, she struggled to lift the unconscious man onto the saddle. Her numb fingers fumbled, but sheer determination drove her forward. Once secured, she handed him the reins, watching as he stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open just long enough to meet hers. There was a flicker of recognition, or perhaps gratitude, before he nodded weakly and urged Willow onward, disappearing into the swirling snow. Ilara stood alone, her chest heaving, her mind racing. Who was he? What secrets did he carry? And why had fate placed him in her path? Shaking off her unease, she turned back to retrieve her scattered belongings, only to find her basket overturned, its contents ruined. With a heavy sigh, she wrapped the broken eggs and scattered herbs in the linen and began the long trek home. By the time she reached her cottage, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, twilight had fallen. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, but something felt off. The gate to the stable hung ajar, and strange footprints marred the pristine snow. Pushing open the door, Ilara found two soldiers standing in her modest home, their uniforms bearing the insignia of the crown. "Miss Delaney," one of them addressed her, his tone polite yet firm. "We've reason to believe someone in this area may have encountered Prince Leander. He vanished 3 days ago during his journey to Windmere. His steed returned riderless, and rumors suggest foul play." Ilara's father, frail and wrapped in a threadbare blanket, shook his head weakly. "No one's come here," he rasped. "No prince, no strangers." The soldier studied Ilara closely, noting the mud on her boots and the tension in her posture. "If you recall anything unusual, report it immediately. The kingdom depends on your cooperation." After they left, Ilara sank into a chair by the fire, clutching the brooch hidden beneath her cloak. She knew she had stumbled upon something far greater than herself, and that her simple act of kindness might change everything. The air was heavy with a profound silence as Ilara crossed the threshold of the cabin where the prince awaited her. The stone walls were covered with tapestries faded by time, yet they still bore traces of elegance in their intricate embroidery. The floor was made of aged wood, worn down by years of use, and the scent of burning firewood permeated the space like a comforting memory. A round table occupied the center of the room, upon which sat a tray laden with freshly baked bread, ripe fruits, and a steaming pot of herbal tea. Everything there seemed meticulously prepared, as if the location had been transformed not just to receive a guest but someone of great importance. Ilara hesitated for a moment before fully entering. Her mind was flooded with questions that struggled to find space amidst her nervousness and curiosity. Who was this man before her? Was he truly the prince whose name echoed in stories told in marketplaces and taverns? And why had he, a royal heir, chosen this remote cabin as a meeting point? Each thought seemed to take on a life of its own, swirling in her head like leaves blown by a restless wind. The prince, who until then had remained motionless by the fireplace, finally spoke. His voice was soft but carried an authority that left no doubt about his position. "You came," he said, his words floating in the air like a gentle breeze. "I wasn't sure you would." Ilara swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. "I wasn't entirely sure I should," she replied, her voice steady despite the whirlwind within. "But here I am." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. There was something in them, a depth that went beyond mere words. They seemed to reflect not only the weight of the crown he bore, but also the scars of invisible battles. He gestured for her to sit at the table. "Please," he said, "we need to talk." Ilara obeyed, sitting in a sturdy wooden chair. Her fingers trembled slightly as she placed her hands in her lap, attempting to hide her anxiety. The prince poured 2 cups of tea, offering her one. The hot steam rose in delicate spirals, spreading a subtle aroma of chamomile and mint. She accepted the cup but barely touched it, her thoughts still caught up in the circumstances that had brought her there. "I want to start by thanking you," he said after a long moment of silence. "Without you, I probably wouldn't be alive right now." His voice was sincere, almost vulnerable, something she would never have expected to hear from someone of his stature. "Your kindness was more than an act of compassion. It was a gesture that changed the course of events." Ilara lowered her eyes, unsure how to respond. "I just did what anyone would do," she murmured, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. Many would have hesitated, perhaps even ignored the wounded stranger in the snow. But something inside her had driven her to act, an instinct she couldn't explain. "No," he gently countered. "You did what few would have had the courage to do, and it made me realize something important." He paused as if searching for the right words. "Kindness is a powerful force, more powerful than many imagine. And sometimes it comes from the most unexpected places." Ilara raised her eyes to meet his again. There was something in his expression that suggested he wasn't just talking about the incident in the forest. His words seemed to carry a hidden meaning, as if he was sharing a part of himself that few ever saw. "But there's more I need to say," he continued, his voice now deeper. "My escape, my disappearance, it wasn't by chance. I needed to leave the palace to escape the walls that imprisoned me. They're not just stones and guards, but expectations, traditions, promises made by others long before I was born. And for a few moments in that icy forest, I tasted freedom, until everything collapsed again." He paused for a moment, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames in the fireplace. "And then you appeared, with your mare, your basket of eggs, and your silent determination. You brought me back to life, literally, but you also showed me something I had forgotten, that even in the humblest circumstances there is nobility. There are people who follow their own principles, without caring about titles or wealth." Ilara felt a lump in her throat. She had never thought of herself in that way. To her, her actions had always been guided by necessity, by survival. But now, hearing his words, she began to see her gesture in a new light. "What happens now?" she finally asked, her voice almost a whisper. He smiled, a brief and melancholic smile. "That depends on both of us. I can return to the palace, resume my place, and continue living under the shadows imposed by others. Or I can try to forge a new path, a path that may be more difficult, but worth walking." Ilara tilted her head, confused. "And me? What's my role in this?" The prince looked at her, his eyes shining with renewed intensity. "You already have a role. You saved my life, yes, but you also made me question who I am and what I want to be. And if you're willing, I'd like to continue counting on your help. Not as a servant or a maid, but as an equal, as someone who can show me truths I'd never discover on my own." Ilara felt her heart race. His words were unexpected, almost surreal. How could someone as simple as her help a prince shape his destiny? And yet, there was something in the way he spoke that made her want to believe. "Let me think," she finally said, rising to her feet. "I need to understand what's at stake. For me, for you, for all of us." He nodded, respecting her decision. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But know this, regardless of what you choose, your courage has already left a mark on me." As she walked back home, Elara felt the weight of his words resting on her shoulders. The world seemed different now, as if every tree and every stone held secrets she didn't yet understand. She knew her life would never be the same again, and perhaps, just perhaps, that was exactly what she needed. The morning air was crisp, as Elara wrapped her cloak tightly around her shoulders. The sky above was overcast, heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never quite delivered. She stepped out of her cottage without looking back, leaving behind a hastily scribbled note near the hearth. "I'll be back before nightfall." The words felt hollow even as she wrote them, as if they were meant to reassure not just her father but herself. The path to the countryside lodge was lined with fallen leaves, their brittle edges crunching beneath her boots. The earth was damp from recent rains, and the scent of wet soil mingled with the sharp tang of pine needles. The wind howled through the trees, bending branches into low boughs, their creaks echoing like whispers in an ancient tongue. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, not because of the terrain, but because of the storm brewing within her chest. What did he want from her? Why had he summoned her to this secluded place? His secrecy gnawed at her thoughts, twisting them into knots she couldn't untangle. The more she tried to rationalize his actions, the more questions arose. Was it gratitude, curiosity, or something deeper, something neither of them dared to name? When she arrived at the lodge, its modest stone facade stood stark against the grey landscape. The roof sloped low, almost touching the ground, and delicate columns framed the porch. A single lantern glowed softly in the vestibule, casting warm light onto the wooden steps. As Elara approached, the door opened before she could knock. A young woman with a solemn expression greeted her silently and led her inside without uttering a word. He was waiting for her by the fireplace, standing tall with his hands clasped behind his back. He wore dark trousers, a pristine white shirt, and a black waistcoat that accentuated his lean frame. His hair, neatly combed back, revealed the faint scar on his temple, a reminder of the day their paths first crossed. When he saw her enter, his rigid posture softened slightly. Though he didn't smile, his eyes betrayed a flicker of relief, as though her presence affirmed something he had long doubted. Elara remained near the doorway, her cloak still wrapped tightly around her. He gestured toward a chair, inviting her to sit. She accepted the offer with a slight nod, her movements deliberate and measured. The room was silent except for the crackling fire and the occasional pop of burning logs. There were no servants, no distractions, just the two of them, suspended in a moment that felt both intimate and fragile. He spoke first, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I wanted to thank you again," he began, his gaze fixed on the flames rather than her face. "What you did, it wasn't just kindness, it was courage, and I owe you more than words can express." Elara kept her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She listened intently, though every word seemed laden with unspoken meaning. His tone was careful, each phrase chosen with precision, as if he were walking a tightrope between honesty and restraint. After a pause, he walked to the desk and retrieved a small leather pouch, the same one he had carried the day of the accident. Handing it to her, he said, "I thought this might belong to you." She opened it cautiously, inspecting its contents, but the items inside weren't hers. Confusion clouded her features as she looked up at him, searching for an explanation. Yet he offered none, his expression unreadable. Then his voice dropped lower, almost hesitant. "Ever since I regained consciousness, I've thought about you. About what you did. I don't know why, but I feel like I needed to see you to truly thank you." His next words struck her like a stone thrown into still water. "But we shouldn't meet again." The room seemed to shrink around her. Her body went numb, though her mind raced with questions. He continued, his voice strained as if the admission pained him. "There are eyes watching, rumors spreading, my world and yours, they aren't meant to intertwine." The morning air was crisp as Ilara wrapped her cloak tightly around her shoulders. The sky above was overcast, heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never quite delivered. She stepped out of her cottage without looking back, leaving behind a hastily scribbled note near the hearth. "I'll be back before nightfall." The words felt hollow even as she wrote them, as if they were meant to reassure not just her father but herself. The path to the countryside lodge was lined with fallen leaves, their brittle edges crunching beneath her boots. The earth was damp from recent rains, and the scent of wet soil mingled with the sharp tang of pine needles. The wind howled through the trees, bending branches into low boughs, their creaks echoing like whispers in an ancient tongue. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, not because of the terrain, but because of the storm brewing within her chest. What did he want from her? Why had he summoned her to this secluded place? His secrecy gnawed at her thoughts, twisting them into knots she couldn't untangle. The more she tried to rationalize his actions, the more questions arose. Was it gratitude, curiosity, or something deeper, something neither of them dared to name? When she arrived at the lodge, its modest stone facade stood stark against the grey landscape. The roof sloped low, almost touching the ground, and delicate columns framed the porch. A single lantern glowed softly in the vestibule, casting warm light onto the wooden steps. As Ilara approached, the door opened before she could knock. A young woman with a solemn expression greeted her silently and led her inside without uttering a word. He was waiting for her by the fireplace, standing tall with his hands clasped behind his back. He wore dark trousers, a pristine white shirt, and a black waistcoat that accentuated his lean frame. His hair, neatly combed back, revealed the faint scar on his temple, a reminder of the day their paths first crossed. When he saw her enter, his rigid posture softened slightly. Though he didn't smile, his eyes betrayed a flicker of relief, as though her presence affirmed something he had long doubted. Ilara remained near the doorway, her cloak still wrapped tightly around her. He gestured toward a chair, inviting her to sit. She accepted the offer with a slight nod, her movements deliberate and measured. The room was silent except for the crackling fire and the occasional pop of burning logs. There were no servants, no distractions, just the two of them, suspended in a moment that felt both intimate and fragile. He spoke first, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I wanted to thank you again," he began, his gaze fixed on the flames rather than her face. "What you did, it wasn't just kindness, it was courage, and I owe you more than words can express." Ilara kept her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She listened intently, though every word seemed laden with unspoken meaning. His tone was careful, each phrase chosen with precision, as if he were walking a tightrope between honesty and restraint. After a pause, he walked to the desk and retrieved a small leather pouch, the same one he had carried the day of the accident. Handing it to her, he said, "I thought this might belong to you." She opened it cautiously, inspecting its contents. But the items inside weren't hers. Confusion clouded her features as she looked up at him, searching for an explanation. Yet he offered none, his expression unreadable. Then his voice dropped lower, almost hesitant. "Ever since I regained consciousness, I've thought about you, about what you did. I don't know why, but I feel like I needed to see you, to truly thank you." His next words struck her like a stone thrown into still water. "But we shouldn't meet again." The room seemed to shrink around her. Her body went numb, though her mind raced with questions. He continued, his voice strained as if the admission pained him. "There are eyes watching, rumors spreading, my world and yours. They aren't meant to intertwine." Prince Leandro moved through the marble halls of the palace with a pace slower than usual. His face still bore the pallor of recent illness, but his eyes were sharp, clear, as though the enforced rest had granted him a newfound clarity. Yet the court around him was far from tranquil. The kingdom's chancellor, a man of meticulous manners and unyielding demeanor, pressed him relentlessly to fulfill the diplomatic commitments agreed upon before his disappearance. The widowed Duchess of Montclair, mother of Selina Ramont, spoke in honeyed tones, her every word dripping with calculated sweetness. She presented her daughter's gestures, each smile, each curtsy, as evidence of virtue and devotion. Selina herself remained in the background, always present, always impeccably dressed in gowns that accentuated her figure, her words carefully measured to please, without yielding too much. She did not openly unsettle Leandro, but her constant presence began to feel like a shadow he could not escape. Leandro responded with polite nods during audiences and practiced smiles at banquets, but within him, a battle more intense than any diplomatic negotiation raged. Every time he heard his mother speak of the Daramon lineage, he saw Arián's hands gripping the wicker basket. Each compliment paid to Selina's obedience reminded him of the peasant woman's unadorned gaze, free of pretense or strategy. One night, seated by the window of his study, Leandro turned to his squire, Dorian. "Do you believe one can belong to two worlds at the same time?" Dorian looked at him with respect, refraining from judgment. "Sometimes, Your Highness, one doesn't belong to either." Leandro smiled, though sadness lingered in his expression. "I can't stop thinking about her. The way she stood there alone as I rode away on her mare. She didn't know my name, yet she didn't let me die." Dorian said nothing, only watched as the prince absently fingered the signet ring on his hand, as if by touching it, he could reclaim something already lost. 2 days later, Byramont dressed itself in celebration to welcome the royal emissaries. No one knew precisely why they had come, only that important announcements were expected. Houses hung banners, the market closed early, and women hurried to wash and iron their finest clothes. Arián had no intention of attending, but her father insisted. "They already talk too much about you," he said firmly. "If you don't go, they'll talk worse." Reluctantly, Arián dressed with care, braiding her hair neatly and tying it with a white ribbon. She wore her least worn cloak, the one least worn by time and hardship, before stepping toward the square. The crowd was so dense that she could barely push through. Voices mingled, smells intertwined, warm bread, burning wood, cheap perfume, and then the trumpets sounded. The royal standards fluttered in the wind, and all eyes turned to the balcony of the newly decorated municipal building, adorned with garlands and winter flowers. There he stood, Leandro, dressed in ceremonial uniform, the golden lily emblazoned on his chest, his dark blue cape billowing behind him. Beside him, polished and poised, stood Marquise Selena Gamon, clad in a wine-colored velvet gown, her head held high, her hands folded with studied perfection. Arián felt the world freeze. Her gaze met his for the briefest moment, but it was enough. He did not look away, nor did he smile. He simply stared at her as if everything else ceased to exist. The bells of the village rang with enthusiasm, announcing the start of the festival of Saint Eloy, patron of blacksmiths and artisans, celebrated by all as a breath of joy amidst the harsh winter. Houses were adorned with golden ribbons and pine branches, windows illuminated by candles casting dancing shadows on stone walls. The air smelled of hot cider, sweet bread, and the contained excitement of a town awaiting this day as if it were an annual miracle. Yet Arián felt out of place. For hours she had stayed at home, pretending to busy herself with trivial tasks, organizing the pantry, shaking out blankets, folding and unfolding the same apron. Her father watched her from his chair by the fire, his patience that of someone waiting for a confession that never came. "You're going," he said suddenly, his eyes fixed on the flames. "No excuses. You can't hide every time someone looks at you, and if you don't go, they'll talk worse. Put on the green dress. It suits you best." Arián looked at him with a mixture of resignation and tenderness. She knew that beneath his gruff exterior, her father only wanted to protect her, or perhaps nudge her toward reclaiming a part of herself. Silently, she nodded. Hours later, with her hair neatly tied back and wearing the green dress reserved for special occasions, Arián crossed the village square. Lanterns strung between trees cast warm glimmers, and musicians played cheerful violin tunes in the central kiosk. Couples spun in circles on the cobblestones, children ran with colorful ribbons, and elders watched from benches covered with blankets. Arián blended into the crowd without meaning to, greeting acquaintances and accepting a cup of hot cider while forcing herself to smile. But her heart beat to a rhythm alien to the music. Something in the air kept her senses alert, as if searching for a presence her mind had yet to comprehend. And then she saw him. Leandro stood on the other side of the square, slightly apart, next to a post decorated with garlands. He wore no cloak, no hat, as if he needed no protection against the cold. His upright posture and impeccable attire set him apart even before anyone noticed his face. But more than his elegance or status, it was his gaze that distinguished him. He wasn't watching the fair, the lights, or the dance. He was looking only at her. A shiver ran up Arián's spine as he began to walk toward her, unhurried, parting the groups of villagers with a confidence no one dared interrupt. He was no longer the wounded stranger from the snow, nor the man who had spoken to her with cold distance at the countryside lodge. He was the prince, and he was coming straight for her. "May I have the pleasure of your company for a walk?" he asked without preamble. Arián hesitated for the briefest moment, then nodded. They walked together along the edges of the square, skirting stalls selling scented candles, spiced bread, and almond sweets. Conversations quieted as they passed, and gazes turned discreetly in their direction. Arián felt it, but said nothing. "I haven't stopped thinking about you," he said when they were far enough from the noise. She gripped the cup of cider tightly in her hands, the steam rising to mingle with the cold air. "You shouldn't say that," she murmured, avoiding his eyes. "Why not?" "Because I'm not of your world and you know it." Leandro stopped. So did she. "That world doesn't matter to me when I'm with you," he said, his sincerity making her knees tremble. Arián lifted her gaze to meet his serene face, but the intensity in his eyes disarmed her. Still, she forced herself to speak. "You may say it doesn't matter, but that doesn't change anything. You have duties. I have roots that don't reach your height. Your people would never accept someone like me." Leandro lowered his gaze for a moment. The silence between them resonated like a bell tolling with contained pain. "Perhaps," he said finally, "but I can't pretend you don't exist." The music continued to play in the distance. Laughter floated in the air, oblivious to the moment enveloping them. "Why did you come tonight?" Arián asked. "To see you," he replied without hesitation, "and to make sure you knew that what happened between us wasn't an accident." She closed her eyes for a moment, his words wrapping around her like a warm gust, but also like a warning. "And now what?" she asked softly. "What am I supposed to do with that?" Leandro didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand and gently tucked a strand of hair the wind had loosened from her braid. The touch was fleeting, but enough to ignite her skin. He said no more, inclining his head slightly as if to take his leave. At that moment, an older man dressed in a long coat and leaning on a carved wooden cane appeared. It was the Count of Maryville, one of the oldest courtiers of Asturia's nobility. He moved slowly, supported by his cane, but his gaze was sharp, his tongue as cutting as a dagger. He observed them for a few seconds and smiled with irony, as if discovering a story to tell. "So she's the peasant everyone's whispering about," he muttered loudly enough for both of them to hear. Leandro turned immediately, but the Count had already turned away, hobbling but satisfied. Arián swallowed hard. Leandro looked at her, but she shook her head silently. Leandro nodded silently, not pressing further. He took her hand for a fleeting moment, his touch as delicate as one handling something fragile, and then he turned away, disappearing into the crowd. Arián remained where she was, alone, as the music resumed its course and the colors and lights swirled around her, without touching her. It was as though an invisible barrier had formed between her and the world, isolating her in a cocoon of thoughts too heavy to unravel. Hours later, in a dimly lit corridor of the northern wing of the palace, Count Maryville approached Marquise Selina Ramon. They were about to retire to the private chambers when he leaned in with practiced courtesy, whispering something softly into her ear. Selina listened without blinking, her perfectly outlined lips curving into a smile before she inclined her head in acknowledgement. The next morning, as Arián drew water from the well, a messenger pigeon descended from the sky, landing gracefully on the kitchen windowsill. Tied to its leg was a letter sealed with red wax. The insignia of House Darramont was unmistakable. The invitation, written in impeccable calligraphy, read, Marquise Selina Ramond requests the pleasure of your company for tea at her countryside residence. Today at 4 o'clock. The carriage moved slowly along the tree-lined path, its wheels creaking against the gravel-covered ground. Arián gazed out the window, taking in the meticulously trimmed hedges, the frost-dusted marble sculptures, and in the distance, the majestic silhouette of the Darramont country estate. The house itself was a grand structure of pale stone, its tall windows framed by heavy curtains that barely allowed a glimpse inside. It exuded an air of calculated opulence, a place designed to remind visitors that the world they were entering was not their own. The coachman brought the carriage to a halt at the foot of the grand staircase. A liveried footman greeted her with a curt gesture and led her through the entrance hall. The marble floor gleamed like a mirror, each step Arián took echoing with uncomfortable clarity. They ascended a carpeted staircase and stopped before a set of double doors, which the footman opened with deliberate slowness. The room beyond was bathed in golden light, filtering through stained glass windows. Tapestries hung from the walls like living paintings, scenes of hunts, embroidered gardens, exotic birds in flight. On an oval table rested a cobalt blue porcelain tea set so delicate it seemed more suited for a museum than daily use. Selina Ramond sat in a high-backed chair, clad in an ivory gown that accentuated her flawless posture. Her hands rested gently on her lap, and her smile, though perfect, did not reach her eyes. "Miss de la Cour," she said, her voice soft and almost melodic, "what a pleasure that you accepted my invitation. I trust the journey was not too uncomfortable." Arián inclined her head in a polite gesture, acutely aware of the stark contrast between her simple attire and the opulent surroundings. She sat where she was directed, on a chair slightly lower than her host's, a difference in height that was no accident. Selina poured the tea with precise movements, not spilling a single drop, as if every gesture were part of a carefully choreographed performance. "I imagine you don't often frequent houses like this," Selina remarked lightly, passing the cup to Arián. Arián held the porcelain with both hands to steady her trembling fingers. "No, it's not my custom," she replied calmly. "It must be fascinating to see how others live, under different circumstances," Selina continued, her tone seemingly friendly, but laced with subtle condescension. Arián did not react outwardly, focusing instead on the floral aroma of the tea, which failed to mask the discomfort of the moment. Selina spoke with apparent amiability, touching on trivial topics, the weather, village festivities, the markets, but each observation carried a clear subtext. She spoke of nobility as if it were a separate species, bound by customs and duties so elevated that mere emotions were relegated to secondary importance. "You must understand," Selina said at one point, avoiding Arián's gaze, "that our position demands certain sacrifices. Not everyone can afford to act solely according to the dictates of the heart." Arián raised her eyes, meeting Selina's gaze. Though the Marquise's smile remained intact, the tension between them was palpable, thick as mountain mist. "Sometimes," Arián replied quietly, "not acting according to the heart is also a sacrifice." Selina blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Then, with practiced grace, she sipped her tea and shifted the conversation as smoothly as a dancer pirouettes across a stage. The encounter lasted only half an hour more, but for Arián it felt like an exercise in restraint, endurance, and silent resistance. She bid farewell with the same courtesy with which she had been received, and as she crossed the threshold once again, she felt as though she could finally breathe. But then, as she turned down the hallway leading to the main staircase, she heard voices emanating from behind a slightly ajar door. She paused, recognizing Selina's voice, now sharper, more genuine. "We can't keep waiting, Mother. The prince is wavering. If we don't push him, he might make an impulsive decision." "I know," another voice, deeper and laced with authority, responded. "This girl from the village is a problem, but the rumors are already spreading. The more we expose her, the more her reputation will crumble. No one will want a future princess with a tarnished name. Tomorrow, we'll send out the invitations for the official announcement. We won't give him room to change his mind." Arián took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't wait to hear more. She fled the house as if escaping a fire, each word she had overheard searing itself into her skin. Under a sky beginning to cloud over, she returned home walking without pause, her face tense and her gaze fixed on the path ahead. That night, she did not light the lamp, did not eat dinner, did not speak to her father. She retreated to her room and let the silence envelop her like a heavy blanket. In the days that followed, she avoided the roads that led to the village, taking longer routes to the mill and steering clear of the square. When she saw an elegant carriage approaching, she hid behind bushes or walls. She declined invitations delivered in neatly written envelopes, a dinner with the Aru family, a special mass at the convent church, an evening with music at the mayor's residence with vague excuses. Leandro noticed her absence. He sent messages with simple pretexts, questions about the mayor, her health, whether she had forgotten something, but she did not respond. She avoided him without words, as if distance could uproot the feelings that had taken root in her chest. Yet the pain did not diminish. It merely changed form, transforming into sleepless nights, repetitive thoughts, and the constant need to remind herself that she could not live an illusion. Meanwhile, Leandro began to falter. His intuition told him something was amiss, that Arián was not rejecting him of her own volition, that someone or something was driving her away. His attempts to see her were fruitless, and the pressures of the court grew heavier with each passing day. The Chancellor reminded him in a low but firm voice that preparations for the official engagement announcement with Selina were underway, that the people needed stability symbols, that a union with a woman of noble lineage would solidify the future reign. His mother spoke of tradition, honor, the mistakes of the past. Leandro listened, nodded, but within him, a thread tightened more and more. And just as resignation began to settle over him like a shadow, he received a letter. It bore no sender's name, written on plain paper without seals or adornments, just a few lines in careful handwriting, unsigned. They are speaking of her openly now. They say she seduced a man of the court, that she offered herself to gain his favor. They say you protect her and will do so at the cost of your throne. Leandro read the words 3 times before lifting his gaze. The ink still wet stained his fingers, but what began to burn within him was not the ink, it was the certainty that time was running out. The moon barely peeked through the clouds when Arián heard the sound of galloping hooves breaking the silence of the afternoon. The noise approached with urgency, as if the rider were defying the icy wind and encroaching darkness. She stepped onto the porch, her heart in her throat, a blanket still draped over her shoulders, her fingers numb from the cold. She knew, even before she saw him, who it was. Leandro dismounted in one swift leap, not waiting for the horse to come to a full stop. His face was tense, his cloak open, his hair tousled from the ride. His eyes found hers with an intensity that made her take a step back. There was something different in his expression, as if a storm had passed through him and left echoes of thunder in his voice. "I need to speak with you," he said simply. Arián remained silent for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. Her first instinct was to close the door, to shield herself from whatever storm had brought him there. But something in his posture, the way his shoulders sagged with exhaustion, stopped her. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. It wasn't an act of surrender. It was a truce. He crossed the threshold slowly, his eyes scanning the room with a mix of recognition and nostalgia. The interior of the cottage smelled of damp wood and freshly baked bread. Her father slept in his usual chair, wrapped in blankets, oblivious to the tension that hung thick in the air. She gestured for him to follow her to the barn. Outside, the sky was painted in deep shades of blue, and the wind carried the last dry leaves of autumn. The barn offered shelter, its wooden walls lit by the trembling golden glow of an oil lamp hanging from a beam. Shadows stretched long across the floor, dancing with the flicker of the flame. The mare chewed quietly in her stall, as if she too understood the gravity of the moment and knew better than to interrupt. Leandro removed his gloves slowly, each movement weighted with unspoken thoughts. Arián stood with her arms crossed, maintaining a distance that couldn't be measured in steps but in fear. "I received a letter," he began, breaking the silence. "It had no signature, but it spoke cruel things about you. Things meant to destroy your reputation, to paint you as someone using me for gain." Arián lowered her gaze. Each word felt like a splinter piercing her skin. "And do you believe it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer immediately. "No," he finally said, "but I'm terrified of others believing it, of them using you as a weapon, as an excuse to force my obedience." She moved to the nearest post, leaning on it for support. Her chest rose and fell with breaths that did little to steady the tremor in her body. "I don't need you to protect me, Leandro. What I need is for you to understand that I can be part of your world." He took a step closer. "And what if I don't want that world without you?" The question hung between them, vibrating like a taut string. Arián raised her eyes to meet his. There was pain in his face, yes, but also something deeper. A struggle that had become unbearable. "Have you made your engagement to the Marquise official?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. He shook his head slowly. "Not yet. They've tried. They've pressured me, but I haven't spoken the words. I haven't signed anything." Arián stepped away from the post, walking a few paces toward the center of the barn. The lamplight fell on her, giving her an almost ethereal glow. "Do you know what you're risking? If you choose to stay with me, you'll lose everything." "I know," he said simply. She closed her eyes, feeling heat rise to her throat, her fingers trembling. It was too much, too real, too late. "I'm scared, Leandro. Not of what they'll say, not of what I'll lose. I'm scared of not being enough, of not knowing how to live in a place where every gesture is judged, where every word is weighed. I don't want to lose myself trying to fit in." He approached slowly, not touching her, not yet, but his presence was as tangible as a brush of fingertips. "I'm scared too," he whispered, "of becoming a man who gives up, of becoming what they expect me to be. The only thing that's given me hope through all of this is you." Tears filled Arián's eyes, though they did not fall. She looked at him, and in her expression there was no weakness, only a strength born of pain, of longing, of the desperate need to believe that perhaps there was still a place for both of them amidst the chaos. The distance between them closed gradually, without haste, without words. Leandro raised a hand and gently brushed her cheek with his fingers. She did not pull away. Closing her eyes, she let the moment suspend itself in the stillness of the barn, in the whisper of the wind against the wooden planks. For a heartbeat, everything narrowed to the shared rhythm of their breathing. They leaned toward each other, their lips inches apart, when suddenly the sound of hooves shattered the fragile peace. Both sprang apart as the barn door flew open. A young messenger in palace livery stood in the doorway, gasping for breath. "Your Highness," he stammered, "the Queen has called an urgent audience. You must return immediately." Leandro's face hardened as he turned to look at the messenger, then back at Arián. Frustration etched into every line of his features. "Don't pull away from me," he whispered. She didn't respond, only nodded, her heart pounding wildly. Without another word, he turned and mounted his horse in one swift motion, riding off into the darkness. The sound of hooves faded quickly into the night. Arián stood frozen, the air around her suddenly colder. She walked to the entrance of the barn and noticed a small object lying near the mare's stall. It was a ring. She picked it up with trembling hands. It was gold, engraved with the royal seal of Astoria. She clutched it to her chest, holding it as if by doing so she could keep him with her just a little longer. At dawn, a firm knock sounded at the door. It wasn't urgent, but it demanded attention. Her father still slept and the house smelled of damp wood and freshly brewed herbal tea. After wiping her hands on her apron, she opened the door, expecting perhaps a neighbor in need of remedies or provisions. But it wasn't any neighbor, it was Henry Delmar, the elderly miller, one of the most respected men in the village. Tall and lean, with piercing eyes and a grave voice, Henry had served as a justice of the peace for over 2 decades. His mere presence carried the weight of accusation. "May I come in?" he asked, his courtesy strained. Arián nodded and led him inside. He removed his hat, approached the fire, and stood with his hands clasped behind his back. "I care for you, Arián, since you were a child. And I respect your father more than any other man alive in this village," he began. "But there are things circulating, things you need to know." She stood before him, meeting his gaze steadily. "They say you've been receiving nightly visits, that a nobleman has come to see you more than once, unseen by witnesses, that you hide in the barn with him. They say you do it behind the village's back, and that you don't care what it means for your name." Arián felt as though ice water had been poured over her soul. "It's not as they say," she whispered. "Nothing has happened that deserves those words." Henry frowned, a mixture of sorrow and sternness in his expression. "The truth doesn't matter as much anymore, child. In villages like ours, What is said weighs more than what is proven. And what they're saying isn't just about you. They're talking about your mother, your father. The way he's raised you, they're tarnishing everything he's worked for. Arián pressed her lips together, feeling a pang of anger and shame, not for her actions, but for how easily they could be twisted in the mouths of others. "Thank you for telling me, Mr. Delmar," she said firmly. "I'll do what's necessary to make sure this doesn't worsen." He nodded gravely, placed his hat back on his head and left without looking back. Arián remained still for a long while, then walked to the barn, still warm from the encounter of the previous night. She knelt in the corner where she had found Leandro's ring and pulled it from her pocket. Holding it between her fingers, she watched as the morning light made the royal seal gleam. "What are you doing to me?" she whispered, as if he could hear her. In the palace, the Duchess of Aramont moved with the precision of someone who had spent her entire life navigating conspiracies cloaked in velvet. Selena accompanied her through the halls, her steps soft and her expression serene, though inside she seethed with impatience. "I have everything," she said, handing over a small package wrapped in linen. "These letters, we acquired them through one of the servants at the market. They're copies, but they look authentic. They say the peasant boasted of her closeness to the prince, spoke of promises, secret meetings, a ring." The Duchess examined the documents with a clinical eye. "This will be enough to sow doubt in the Queen. If there's one thing Her Majesty despises more than scandal, it's being caught in one without warning." Hours later, in the private chamber of the West Wing, the Queen reviewed the supposed testimonies with a furrowed brow. The letters were brief, containing just enough detail to seem credible, though they lacked definitive proof. But in the court, half-truths were poison enough. "I cannot allow this matter to grow further," she said, handing the documents to the Chancellor. "If Leandro has committed an imprudence, it must be corrected with firmness. The Marquise Selena possesses all the attributes to stand beside him, and this engagement must be sealed before the people begin to whisper." Leandro received the news that same afternoon in his study. The golden light of sunset painted the stone walls, but he barely noticed it. The Chancellor handed him the package without expression. "The Queen has made her decision," he said. "The official announcement will be made in 3 days. I advise you to prepare yourself." Leandro did not respond. He opened the documents and began to read, recognizing some phrases. They were things Arián had whispered to him in private moments, soft, intimate words. But here they were twisted, distorted into something unrecognizable. What had once been tender confessions now seemed like calculated manipulations, as if someone had taken the most sacred fragments of their connection and turned them into weapons. "This isn't true," he murmured, his voice strained. "Perhaps it isn't," the Chancellor replied, his tone clinical. "But it appears real, and in politics, appearance is often enough." Leandro closed his eyes, a mixture of fury and pain rising in his throat like a scream he couldn't release. Meanwhile, Arián remained oblivious to the letters, the manipulated testimonies, and the storm brewing around her. She only felt the walls of her world closing in. The looks at the market grew colder. Neighbors who had once greeted her warmly now avoided her gaze. Even regular customers bypassed her stall, leaving her isolated. Unable to defend herself, she retreated into silence. She couldn't explain what had happened, not fully, not even to herself. The ring, hidden in a handkerchief tucked among her belongings, had become a constant reminder of what she had lost before she ever truly possessed it. It was a fragment of a dream that now felt impossibly out of reach. 3 days after the encounter in the barn, another letter arrived at her door. This time there was no messenger, no pigeon, just an envelope slipped under the door, sealed with red wax bearing the royal crest. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The text was brief. "The people of Beaumont are hereby informed that the official engagement between His Highness, Prince Leandro of Astoria, and Marquise Selena Ramon will be formally announced in 3 days at a private ceremony in the Winter Palace." There was no farewell, no signature, only an announcement and a sentence. Arián read the letter one final time, before folding it carefully and placing it alongside the few belongings she had decided to take with her. She had kept it in a wooden box since it arrived, but that morning, after seeing the palace seal on the announcement of an engagement that excluded her entirely, she knew she could no longer stay. Not in Beaumont, not in the house where every corner held a memory of something fleeting yet profoundly real. Aunt Mile wrote to me months ago, she told her father that night as they sat by the fire. She offered to let me stay with her if I ever needed a break. She lives near the sea in a quiet village to the south. I could go for a while just until things calmed down. Her father studied her for a long moment. His eyes were sad, but he didn't argue. He had watched the light dim in her eyes over the past days, seen how the rumors wounded her more deeply than any physical injury. Whether out of pride or love, she refused to speak the name of the man who had changed her life. "It's all right, my child. I'll be fine. Mrs. Elois will help me with the house. The mill still pays me enough for bread," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Go, Arián, but don't leave thinking you're running away. Go to find peace, and if you ever return, do so with your head held high." She leaned forward and embraced him tightly. That night, she slept little, the creaking of the wind mingling with the ache of closing each door that had protected her for years. The seaside village was small, nestled on a hill that sloped down to a rocky coast where the waves crashed with relentless force. The houses were made of weathered wood, their roofs low and sloping. The air smelled of salt, seaweed, and freedom. Aunt Mile lived alone in a cottage with walls adorned with dried flowers and ceramic vases. She was a strong woman, her grey hair pulled back into a tight bun, her gaze piercing but softened by quiet tenderness. Arián adapted to the slow rhythm of the village. She helped in the garden, washed clothes, chopped wood, and walked along the cliffs at sunset, letting the wind untangle her soul. In the evenings, she and her aunt sat by the fire, drinking herbal infusions. One night, Mile spoke without asking for details, sharing her own story of love and loss. "I once loved someone I couldn't have, a young naval officer, the son of a noble family. He left on an expedition and never returned. My father opposed us and society mocked me, but I stayed with the memory of a love that was brief yet indelible. I never regretted loving him," she said, staring into the flames. "I only regret staying silent for so long. Silence weighs heavier with each passing year." Arián listened, her eyes wet with unshed tears, saying nothing. Slowly, the sharp edges of her pain dulled, becoming a distant echo. It didn't disappear, but it became bearable. She began to laugh again, small, simple joys, like a clumsy seagull crashing into a window or a stubborn sheep refusing to cross a bridge. She found pleasure in cold sunrises, the smell of freshly baked bread, and the dampness of her hands after washing vegetables. But every night as she undressed, she touched the small signet ring hidden in the hem of her dress. She did it unconsciously, a reflex, and each time her mind returned to him. Meanwhile, Leandro lived a different kind of exile. The palace buzzed with preparations, florists, musicians, seamstresses, all working tirelessly for the grand announcement. The queen oversaw every detail with meticulous precision. Selina appeared at every rehearsal, smiling perfectly, dressed in new gowns, delivering appropriate phrases for every occasion. She was everything protocol demanded, everything Astoria expected. Yet Leandro felt himself drifting further from who he was. His days became routine, heavy. The words of the courtiers, once familiar, now sounded hollow. His thoughts wandered to a simple farm, to a girl with an honest gaze, to a barn where he had almost found a truth he couldn't bring himself to name. It was his mentor, the elderly Count Adrián, who found him one afternoon wandering alone through the winter gardens. "So many roses, yet none with a fragrance to wake you, eh?" he said gently, sitting beside him on the bench. Leandro managed a faint smile. How does one return to being who they were when they no longer feel part of that world? The Count observed him with compassion, then took out a handkerchief and cleaned his glasses. "Son, the question isn't about returning to who you were. It's about deciding who you want to become. Do you truly believe duty is worth more than what makes you feel alive?" Leandro didn't answer. He stared at the grey clouds covering the sky and thought of Arián, how she had looked at him that night in the barn, how she hadn't called out when she dropped his ring. That same night in his room, he found a letter waiting on his desk. There was no seal. The envelope was plain paper. The handwriting was elegant but unadorned. He opened it carefully and read, "Not all vows are made at the altar. Some are born in the snow between silence and a glance." There was no signature, only that single line. Leandro held the paper between trembling fingers, as if it were fragile, as if squeezing it might make it vanish. His heart pounded in his chest, not from surprise but from confirmation. Those words could only have come from one person, and with them, he understood that the time he had left to correct his mistake was running out. The dawn at the Winter Palace unfolded with its usual solemnity: polished corridors, windows fogged by the cold, the echo of measured footsteps beneath the central dome. But Leandro felt none of it. Since reading the anonymous letter, the phrase had unearthed emotions he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Something inside him had broken, or perhaps awakened. That day he skipped the council meeting and the protocol rehearsals for the engagement ceremony. Instead, he locked himself in his study with a determination that required no explanation. No one dared interrupt him except one. "Are you sure about what you're doing?" asked Dorian, his squire, watching him sift through old documents and recent letters. Leandro looked up, his gaze sharper than ever. "I need to know where these rumors came from. I want names, dates, details, and I want them today." Dorian nodded without question. He recognized that expression. He had seen it only once before, when Leandro, as a teenager, had refused to sign an unjust treaty with the Eastern Lords, even at the cost of earning the king's disapproval. Hours passed as documents, servant testimonies, and hallway whispers yielded little progress, until an intercepted letter changed everything. It was addressed to the steward of House Daramont, confirming a generous payment to ensure certain comments reached convenient ears. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was more than enough for Leandro. That same night, Leandro requested a private audience with Selina. She received him in the greenhouse, surrounded by orchids and camellias, dressed in an impeccable ivory ensemble, her expression serene and unshaken, even as he placed the intercepted letter on the wrought iron table. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. Selina barely glanced at the paper before taking a sip from her porcelain teacup. "I suppose you've discovered what you were looking for," she replied, her breathing steady, her composure unbroken. "Why did you do it?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly, despite his effort to remain calm. "Because you needed someone to remind you what it means to be a prince, what is expected of you," she said, finally raising her eyes to meet his. "And because, Leandro, a fantasy in a barn does not build a kingdom." He clenched his fists, the pain in his chest no longer just about what she had done, but about what he had allowed, his silence, his hesitation, his own cowardice. Arián had never said a word, never asked for anything. Everything that circulated had been planted by Selina. She finally showed a flicker of emotion, not guilt, not regret, but frustration. "And what did you expect? That I would sit idly by while you ruin a treaty, a lineage, a structure that has upheld this crown for generations? I have been groomed my entire life to stand by your side, and you, with your glances and your escapades, let yourself be charmed by a peasant with sad eyes. Don't leave your soul in debt to me, Selina. You don't deserve it," he murmured, turning away without another word. There would be no apologies, no turning back. Hours later, Leandro requested an audience with the Queen. The private chamber was cloaked in silence as he entered. She sat in her gilded chair, watching him with the weariness of someone who already knew the outcome. "You're going to refuse," she said before he could speak. "I will not make the announcement, Mother, and I will not marry someone I do not trust," he declared firmly. "And what do you expect? That the people will understand, that the nobles won't rebel? I expect the people to see a man who decided to stop lying to himself, and a crown that no longer builds itself on betrayals," he replied. The Queen studied him for a long moment. Her expression was cold, but deep within her eyes, something more complex flickered. Perhaps respect, perhaps resignation. "The event proceeds as planned. If you decide to speak, do so at your own risk. But I will not stop the machinery for a whim." Leandro nodded. "Then I will speak." That night in his chamber, lit only by a single candle, with his heart more exposed than ever, he took paper and quill. He wrote slowly, as if each word needed to cross a bridge between duty and desire. "Arián, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know you remained silent when you could have defended yourself, and that you were hurt while I hesitated. But I want you to know the truth. The rumors were not born from your voice, but from the ambition of others. I no longer trust the court, but I do trust what I felt when I saw you in the snow. when you gave me your mare without knowing who I was. That moment was more real than anything I've lived in this palace. I have decided not to make the announcement. I have decided to fight. I don't know what lies ahead or if I will succeed, but I want you to know this. If you still carry me in your memory, even a little, wait for me. I will come for you." Leandro folded the letter and sealed it with his personal emblem, a golden lily embossed in blue wax. Then he called Dorian. "Deliver it yourself. I trust no one else." "To where?" the squire asked. "To the coastal village where she sought refuge. Ask for Maëlle de la Cour. She will know how to find her." Dorian set out before dawn. Hundreds of miles away, the sea roared against the cliffs. Arián was in her aunt's orchard, gathering baskets of red apples, her apron smeared with dirt, her hands rough from work. The air smelled of salt and autumn, and the sky bore a silvery hue that promised rain. As she bent to lift another basket, she heard the gallop of a horse. Looking up, she saw a rider descending the path. He was alone, but his bearing and the color of his cloak spoke of origins far removed from the local fishermen. Arián's heart began to race, though she couldn't explain why. The horse stopped at the gate. The royal squire dismounted with agility and approached with firm steps. In his hand, he held a letter sealed with Leandro's emblem. The sea roared against the rocks as Arián, seated on the edge of the cliff, read the letter over and over. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the emotions bubbling beneath her skin. Leandro's seal still hung from the blue ribbon she had untied so slowly, as if the simple act of opening the letter could change the course of the world. The words, written in a firm but unadorned hand, resonated in her chest like an intimate, undeniable whisper. He not only remembered her, he loved her. It wasn't a fantasy, an impulsive mistake, or a story doomed to fade under the weight of duty. It was real. And Leandro, prince of the realm, was willing to face his mother, the entire court, the weight of generations for her. The letter was a confession, but also a bridge. For the first time since she had fled, Arián felt that perhaps not everything was lost. She spent the night awake, sitting by the window, watching the stars move slowly across the sky. Her Aunt Maëlle asked no questions. She prepared tea, stroked Arián's hair as she had when she was a child, and gave her space to think. When the first light of dawn painted the waves pink, Arián rose with determination. "I want to go back," she said, her voice raspy from lack of sleep but clear as crystal. "If he's going to fight, then I must too." Maëlle nodded, her eyes shining though she didn't shed tears. "Go with a steadfast heart, niece, but remember that you'll also need courage to stay if they choose you, and to leave if they don't." They packed lightly. A single trunk, the green dress her mother had embroidered years ago, the signet ring she still kept hidden, and a letter she decided to write in response, though she wasn't sure yet if she would deliver it. The post station was 2 hours away by carriage. The wind whistled through the trees along the road, and seagulls flew high, as if heralding a change. Arián climbed into the carriage without looking back. In the capital, rumors raced like wildfire through the palace halls. The ceremony for the announcement of Prince Leandro's engagement to Marquise Selina d'Agamont was scheduled for noon, and the nobles began to arrive dressed in their finest brocades and silks, trailing their capes and centuries of tradition behind them. But Leandro was not in the main hall. Accompanied only by his squire and Count Adrian, he made his way to the royal council, where the principal ministers, royal advisors, and the Queen Mother were gathered, the austere and solemn council chamber filled with tense silence as he entered. "What does this mean, Your Highness?" one of the ministers asked, as Leandro approached without announcement. Leandro stopped before the central table and spoke with a firm voice. "I have come to formally and definitively declare that I do not wish to continue with the engagement established between this crown and the House of d'Aramont." A murmur erupted among those present. The Queen rose immediately. "What are you saying?" she demanded, her tone sharp. "That I have made a personal decision," he replied, his voice steady. "And though I respect tradition, I will not marry someone out of obligation. My duty is to govern with both heart and reason, not with fear or chains." The Justice Minister coughed nervously. "Your Highness, your duty." "My duty is to lead with integrity," Leandro interrupted. Not with submission. The queen approached, her eyes blazing with indignation. There is no time for reconsideration. The ceremony is underway. If I dare speak publicly of this, I will, Leandro responded. I will not stop now. Minutes later, the doors of the grand hall burst open. All faces turned toward the prince, who entered without escort, dressed in his blue uniform, the golden lily pinned to his chest, and an expression of steel on his face. The master of ceremonies attempted to announce him, but Leandro raised a hand to silence him. He ascended the central platform from which he usually delivered official speeches. His mother stood near the throne, pale with fury. Selina, immaculate and with an expression colder than ever, stared at him without blinking. "People of Astoria," Leandro began, his voice echoing under the dome. "I know what is expected of me, but this time, I will not fulfill that expectation. I will not make this announcement. I will not accept this engagement." A ripple of shock ran through the hall like an electric current. "My heart belongs to someone else," he continued. "Someone without title or wealth, but who showed me, through an act of compassion, what true love is. I will not name this person out of respect for their privacy, but know that my decision is final. I will take no further steps down a path I did not choose." A profound silence followed his words. The nobility divided into scandalized glares and sincere looks of admiration. Some nodded in approval, while others whispered with furrowed brows. But in the upper galleries, where representatives of the common people stood, a timid applause broke out, followed by another and then a standing ovation. It was the story everyone wanted to believe, a peasant who saved the prince, and a prince who renounced gold for love. At that precise moment, Arián's carriage descended along the main avenue. The wheels struck the cobblestones with a rhythmic clatter, and the sound of hooves echoed between the stone buildings. To one side, the royal gardens stretched wide and vibrant, their branches still adorned with the last golden hues of autumn. When the carriage came to a halt, the coachman opened the door. Arián stepped down cautiously, wearing the green dress and a woolen coat. Her hair fell in soft waves, her expression was resolute, but her heart pounded like a drum. Before her, a crowd began to disperse, murmuring and gesturing animatedly, their faces filled with astonishment. And then she saw him. Leandro standing near the steps of the throne hall, surrounded by guards, nobles and advisors. His bearing was majestic, but his eyes scanned the area with evident anxiety, as if searching for something or someone. Arián remained where she was, watching him from a distance. Her lips trembled with the urge to run to him, but her feet stayed rooted. Not yet. The echo of Leandro's footsteps reverberated through the grand gallery of the palace's northern wing. The tapestries, once majestic in his eyes, now felt like veils of a history that no longer belonged to him. The portraits of ancient kings stared down from the walls with cold, judging eyes, as if weighing the decision he was about to reaffirm. But he did not hesitate, not anymore. The audience with the Queen and the Council took place in a private chamber, decorated with sober elegance yet heavy with symbols of power. Golden shields, marble statues, and thick curtains that barely allowed the midday light to filter through. Seated around a large oval table were the kingdom's oldest advisors, the finance minister, the foreign relations minister, the head of the royal guard, and the archbishop, all with grave expressions. At the center sat the Queen Mother, clad in steel grey, her composure unshaken, though her fingers tapped the armrest with a barely perceptible rhythm. "You have unleashed a political conflict we cannot afford, my son," the Queen began without preamble. "The alliance with the House of Monberg hinges on the union with the Daramonts. Breaking this engagement weakens our position against the East. If the stability of the realm depends on a forced marriage, then the cost is too high," Leandro replied, his voice steady but firm, filling the room with quiet resolve. "Are you willing to risk the stability of the kingdom for a woman without titles, without courtly education, without noble lineage?" asked the foreign relations minister. "Am I willing," Leandro countered, "to face whatever comes my way to defend my freedom and hers?" A murmur rippled through the room. The archbishop raised an eyebrow. "The crown is not a whim, Your Highness. Duty stands above the desires of the heart." "I do not desire a crown that turns me into a slave," Leandro declared, and in that moment, he took a step forward, as if his determination had transformed into a sword. "If you attempt to force me into a marriage against my will, I will renounce the throne today." The silence that followed was absolute. The queen remained motionless, a muscle twitching in her jaw, but she said nothing. The advisors exchanged bewildered glances. No one had expected such a direct threat, and no one doubted that if Leandro spoke in earnest, he would carry his promise to its ultimate consequences. At that moment, Marquise Selina entered without announcement. She wore an impeccable outfit, her hair braided and adorned with pearls. In her hand she carried a folder, and her steps were as silent as her voice, which cut through the tension in the air as she addressed the queen. "Your Majesty," she said with controlled reverence, "before a final decision is made, I would like to present a document that may shed light on the situation." The queen looked at her without nodding, but did not stop her either. Selina approached and placed a sealed parchment on the table, bearing the crest of the Daramonts. "It is a complete genealogy of the young Arián de la Cour. Her ancestry has been investigated, and she possesses no noble bloodline, none." "That we already knew," Leandro said calmly, though the tension in his shoulders was evident. "Yes, but she concealed it," Selina replied. "She presented herself at the fair as an ordinary person, but later allowed herself to be known to be idealized. If the people believe that a princess can rise without nobility, what prevents anyone from demanding a seat on the throne tomorrow?" The justice minister muttered something about precedents, and the finance minister nodded worriedly, but Leandro stepped forward. "What she possesses cannot be found in blue blood or an ancient surname. What she did, what she was capable of giving without asking for anything in return, is more noble than anything I have seen within these walls. If you do not understand that, then you do not understand why it is worth changing the kingdom." A dense silence fell once again. Meanwhile, in a private chamber in the western wing, Arián waited, standing by a window that overlooked the inner garden. The servant who had received her, a kindly man of middle age, had said little, only that she was expected, that it was time to see someone who had been seeking her for days. Through the window she saw Leandro. He was alone, walking among the boxwood hedges and the elegantly dripping fountains. He wore no cloak, and the wind tousled his hair. He seemed detached from the world, lost in thoughts as heavy as the silence that enveloped them. Arián closed her eyes for a moment. Then the servant led her through a narrow corridor and opened a door to a small unadorned salon, containing only a covered piano and a vase of lilies. He was there. Both stopped upon seeing each other. They did not speak, only observed, as if every glance were an unwritten letter. Leandro took a step, then another, and extended his hand, not as a prince, not with the distance of royalty, nor with the authority of one demanding obedience. He extended his hand as a man who had chosen. "If you are here," he said finally, "it is because there is still something in you that has not let me go. And if there is still something, I will fight for it." Arián looked at him for a long moment, then took his hand, not as one surrendering, but as one deciding to walk beside him. They stood there united by a gesture that spoke louder than any vow, but they knew they had not yet won. The hardest part was yet to come. At that precise moment, a knock sounded at the door. The same servant from before, his expression grave, bowed his head. "The Queen requests the immediate presence of Miss de la Cour in the throne hall before the entire court." The grand throne hall glittered under the light of crystal chandeliers, hanging like fixed constellations above the heads of the gathered nobles. The towering marble columns framed a solemn and tense space. The rustle of silk, the contained whispers, the nervous flutter of fans, all spoke of an anticipation that spread like an invisible tide. Up high, seated with the regal posture that only years of power could teach, the Queen Mother observed from her golden throne. To her right, the ministers stood aligned, their faces like stone. To her left, Marquise Selina, dressed in pale grey, almost silver, held her chin high with impeccable dignity. The doors of the hall opened slowly, and silence fell like a veil. Arián entered alone, wearing a simple dark blue wool dress, unadorned except for a worn velvet ribbon cinched at her waist. She wore no jewels, her braided hair pulled back to reveal her clear face. She walked with firm, unhurried steps, her head held high and her shoulders straight. Each step on the marble resonated like a silent declaration. The nobility watched her with piercing scrutiny, some with thinly veiled disdain, others with curiosity, and a few with something akin to respect. Arián stopped in the center of the hall, facing the queen. The silence was so thick that the faint creak of the chandeliers under the heat of the candles could be heard. The queen looked at her, as if peeling back her very soul. There was no mockery in her expression, but her authority was cutting. "Miss de la Cour," she said finally, her voice resonating throughout the hall, "you are here because my son has decided to expose this situation before the entire kingdom. He has declared that his heart belongs to you, that he would renounce his position to stand by your side." Arián inhaled slowly before responding, her voice steady and unwavering. "I wouldn't know how to say when this bond began," she said, her gaze sweeping across the hall without lowering her eyes. Many faces watched her, some with surprise, noting that she did not tremble, that she offered no apology for being there. "It was winter," she continued. "I was walking along a snowy path to sell herbs and eggs at the market. I found a man lying unconscious in the snow, injured and alone. I didn't know who he was, he never told me his name. His horse had fled, and he was bleeding from a head wound. So, I gave him mine." A faint murmur rippled through the room. "You gave him your horse?" one of the advisors interjected, incredulous, as if unable to comprehend such an act without ulterior motive. "Yes," Arián replied without hesitation, "because he was in danger, because it was the right thing to do." The queen narrowed her eyes. "And what did you expect in return?" "Nothing," Arián responded with the same calm. "I never thought I would see him again. Nor did I know he was the prince until many days later, when he appeared in the village, blending in among the people. I didn't seek him out. It was he who returned." Leandro, standing near the throne, took a step forward. "And I returned because I couldn't forget," he said, his voice clear and resolute. "Something about this woman, her gesture, her quiet strength, changed me. It wasn't a political act nor a strategy. It was truth." Marquise Selena observed him impassively, while the archbishop furrowed his brow. "For your majesty," he addressed the queen, "what the people are witnessing today is an heir who wishes to break a diplomatic agreement for an emotion. Where does that leave the balance of the kingdom?" Leandro lifted his chin. "There is no alliance stronger than one born of honesty. If you force this woman away, if you compel me to marry someone I do not love, we will lose something far more valuable than a treaty. We will lose the people, and we will lose the soul of the realm." For a moment, only the crackling of the torches could be heard. Then a feminine voice rose from among the attendees. It belonged to an elderly countess with white hair and moist eyes. "I too was forced into a marriage of convenience," she said softly. "I never loved my husband, and I have spent my life wondering what might have been if I had been allowed to choose." Another noble nodded silently. The queen surveyed the room. The murmurs had shifted. Some still disapproved, yes, but others were beginning to sympathize. The queen inhaled deeply. Her voice was quieter now, but no less clear. "The people love stories with heart, but a king cannot rule without a head. However, a king who abdicates for love may become a legend, and a legend, well guided, can be worth more than 100 alliances." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "I am not a soft woman, but neither am I a fool. If you were to renounce the throne, Leandro, the people would see weakness. But if you fight for what you love and manage to keep the kingdom from crumbling, then perhaps you can turn your choice into strength." She turned to Arián. "I have no reason to trust you, but I can recognize the mettle of someone who has not begged for their place. You have my provisional blessing." The room erupted in murmurs, but Leandro wasted no time. He walked to Arián and extended his hand. She took it, and in that moment, the simple act of intertwining their fingers seemed to seal something far deeper than an agreement. It was a public promise, a declaration of intent. They were no longer prince and peasant. They were two souls who had endured every trial, united in the face of the world's judgment. But just as the murmurs began to transform into hesitant applause, a servant entered, breathless and sweating, clutching a letter in his hand. "Urgent, Your Majesty," he said, handing it to the Queen. She broke the seal with suspicion. The crest of Montevert gleamed on the parchment. She read in silence, then spoke without raising her voice. "The House of Montevert has accepted a new proposal for a commercial alliance. It seems Prince Leandro himself negotiated a treaty that preserves the agreement without the need for marriage." The entire hall held its breath, and then it erupted. The air in the palace felt different, as though the very walls had exhaled after years of suppressed sighs. The atmosphere, though still solemn, had lightened. The halls were no longer filled solely with intrigue and formality. Soft laughter began to echo, sincere conversations unfolded, and glances were exchanged without calculation. The decision made in the throne room resonated not only among the nobility, but also in the hearts of the people. The capital's newspapers published carefully crafted chronicles, each more poetic than the last. The prince who chose love over the crown, the woman who never asked but knew how to wait. A new era blooms in Astoria. Though royalty never officially acknowledged popular publications, copies circulated through the palace corridors with the enthusiasm of shared secrets. Marquise Selina departed without scandal. It was in the early hours of the second day after the audience that she packed her belongings, aided silently by her maids. She did not ask for farewells, nor did she request explanations. She simply donned the plainest coat from her wardrobe, braided her hair simply, and walked to the carriage that would take her back to her family estate in the highlands of Bernal. Her mother, the Duchess d'Aramont, awaited her inside the vehicle. The Duchess did not reprimand her, nor did she cry. She simply took her daughter's hand firmly and said, "There are paths longer than the one to the throne, and alliances more powerful than those forged in gilded halls. You still have a role in this story, it just won't be as queen." Selina did not respond, but in her steady, serene gaze there was no defeat, only the determination of someone who knows that graceful losses can sow unexpected futures. In the days that followed, the Queen Mother surprised the court with a gesture few had anticipated. She ordered a full review of the royal matrimonial protocol. Citing the example lived with both pain and dignity, she drafted a decree that, without abolishing traditions entirely, allowed royal heirs to request personal consideration in choosing a partner, as long as the union adhered to principles of integrity, service, and public respect. Some were scandalized in private, others in silence felt relieved. Many understood they were witnessing the beginning of something new. Arián no longer walked alone through the palace corridors. Her father, who had regained his strength after weeks of care, was welcomed as an honored guest in the Western Wing. On the day of his arrival, he was greeted by a group of physicians under direct orders from the Queen, and by Leandro himself, who helped him down from the carriage and guided him along a path flanked by lilies. "I don't know if I'll ever get used to being called Don Guillaume with such reverence," the farmer murmured, half joking, as he gazed at the gardens with wide-eyed wonder. "We'll all have to get used to it, Father," Arián said, taking his arm. "To new beginnings." From her corner by the sea, Aunt Mile received a letter bearing the royal seal. It was delivered by a lady dressed in navy blue, who remained silent as the older woman opened it with trembling hands. The content was brief but clear. A personal thank you from the Queen for having sheltered and guided a young woman who, unknowingly, was destined to be part of Astoria's transformation, and an invitation to visit when the weather improved, with a carriage at her disposal and a promise of restful comfort. Maëlle smiled faintly, then folded the letter carefully and placed it in a wooden box where she kept only the things that truly mattered. The village of Viremont, that forgotten corner between mountains and snow, became a living legend. Children played at being princes saved by brave maidens. Adults recounted with borrowed pride that one of their own now walked through the royal gardens. Market sales doubled. Travelers arrived just to see the snowy path where it was said everything had begun. The local church organized a festival with paper lanterns, sweetbread, and an improvised theater where villagers reenacted, with more enthusiasm than precision, the barn scene where the wounded prince had been given a borrowed horse. The elders laughed, the women knitted in circles, and the young dreamed. At the palace, the courtiers who had fueled the initial rumors were summoned to a private meeting. There, the queen did not raise her voice, impose punishments, or issue sentences, but her words were sharper than any penalty. "The crown does not need more sharp tongues," she said. "It needs hearts that know when to remain silent and when to listen. Learn from this and do not forget." There were no dismissals, no public shaming. It was more than a sanction, it was a lesson. And some of them in time would become the most loyal defenders of the court's new chapter. One clear morning, Arián walked alongside Leandro through a newly renovated wing of the palace. Workers were laying the final bricks of a wall that would frame a new garden. A dreamy-eyed architect spread plans across an improvised table, explaining with enthusiasm how each path would follow the shape of a natural spiral, how the flower beds would be planted with wildflowers, and how a fountain at the center would be surrounded by stones collected from the village of Viramont. "It will be a garden that does not shout its beauty," the architect said, but whispers it like a story told in confidence. Arián approached one of the plans. In the corner, written in elegant script, was the proposed name, Arián's Garden. Leandro took her hand. "This is only the beginning." The morning had dawned with an almost sacred serenity. The royal gardens, usually silent at that hour, buzzed with a measured but palpable excitement. Servants crossed paths carrying silver trays, gardeners made the final adjustments to the hedges, and musicians tuned their instruments discreetly beneath white linen canopies. On the stone pathways, snowflakes fell slowly, as if the sky itself understood the need for gentleness on this long-awaited day. Months had passed since the audience in the throne hall. Time had woven new alliances, healed political wounds, and softened the rigidity of old protocols. The court had grown accustomed to seeing Arián walking among diplomats, speaking with simple wisdom, and tending to the details of the garden that now bore her name. Her presence, once the subject of whispers, had become a symbol of a new kind of royalty, close, firm, real. The ceremony of her union with Leandro would not be public or ostentatious. They had decided together. There would be no golden domes, no endless carpets, no choirs of 100 voices. Her countenance, once steely, now radiated a calmness that surprised even the oldest courtiers. She had come to accept that her son's story would not be written like hers, and perhaps, because of that, it would be better. From Viramont, a dozen villagers chosen by lottery had arrived, dressed in traditional embroidered attire crafted by calloused hands. They were seated in a place of honor, alongside the council representatives. Many of them watched with moist eyes, as if unable to believe they were there, in the heart of the palace, invited by name, and granted a reserved spot in the kingdom's history. Guillaume de la Cour, Arián's father, stood beside her as the musicians began a soft string melody. He carried a cane decorated with linen ribbons, a gift from Leandro himself, and his eyes shone with the contained pride of a man who had seen his daughter blossom against all odds. Arián walked along the garden path, past the stone benches, with snow falling gently into her braided hair. Her dress was made of fine ivory wool, with silver threads sewn by hand. She wore no crown, no veil, only a blue ribbon around her waist, a symbol of her humble origins, and a sprig of rosemary pinned to her bodice, a sign of remembrance and true love. Leandro awaited her by the fountain, clad in his ceremonial uniform, but without a sword, only a golden sash crossing his chest. When their eyes met, something invisible seemed to melt in the air. They were no longer prince and peasant, nor scandal and rumor. They were simply two people who had chosen not to let go. The archbishop began the ceremony with brief but meaningful words. He spoke not of titles but of paths traveled. He did not enumerate pacts or duties, but rather decisions made with courage. And when he asked them to exchange vows, Leandro took Arián's hands in his and spoke without the need for paper. "Today, I do not promise you a throne, nor jewels, nor a shield. I promise you my ear when the world grows loud, I promise my steps alongside yours, even when the path is uncertain. And I promise this love which grew in silence but now speaks with the voice of all that I am." With a trembling voice, Arián responded, "I have no lineage to offer you, no surname to be written in history books, but I have faith in what we feel. I have my hands, my thoughts, and the desire that every day we may look at each other as we do today, without fear, without masks." The Archbishop blessed their union, and as soft applause rose, Leandro leaned in and kissed her, not as a ceremonial act, but as an intimate, everyday gesture, honest and tender. The music swelled and the villagers stood up. Wine began to flow in ceramic cups and jugs. There were dances in the style of Viramont, with fast violins and steps that made even the sternest ministers laugh. Guillaume danced with the Queen, while Aunt Maëlle conversed with the Archbishop about herbal infusions for insomnia. That evening, the people felt that the palace belonged to them just a little more. As the sun began to set behind the walls, painting the sky in shades of gold and lilac, Arián quietly slipped away from the bustle. She walked alone among the hedges, along the freshly snow-covered paths, feeling the soft crunch of frost underfoot. She reached the center of the garden that bore her name, stopping before the fountain to watch as the reflection of the sunset dissolved in the water. The statues seemed to gaze upon her, complicit in her silence. Then she heard footsteps behind her. Leandro appeared wearing a long coat, his hair tousled by the breeze, his eyes shining without words. He said nothing, only extended his hand. She took it, and together they walked to the overlook, where the horizon stretched over the valleys of Astoria, immense, tranquil, bathed in a light that seemed eternal. On the stone archway leading into the garden, an ancient parchment hung inscribed with firm handwriting, "Where nobility unites with the courage of the heart, the love that defies kingdoms shall bloom." Thank you very much for listening to this story until the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We would love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the story? Leave us a comment, telling us where you're listening from and what you liked most. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a sign of support. It motivates us so much to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotions and lessons. And before we say goodbye, we want to remind you that a recommendation for another exciting and charming story will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.